The Whispering Woods had a dark reputation, but Silas only cared about land value. As a senior surveyor, his job was to map the dense, forgotten forest on the edge of Blackwood Valley. Armed with a GPS, a heavy machete, and black coffee, he stepped into the damp, suffocating overgrowth. The canopy swallowed the sunlight, plunging the floor into an emerald twilight. Silas checked his digital map. This land had been entirely untouched since a late 19th century settlement vanished overnight. By midday, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Birdsong and animal rustling vanished, replaced by a dense silence that pressed against his eardrums. Silas paused, shaking his head at his rising nerves. Pushing past a curtain of moss, he froze. A rusted iron crib sat perfectly upright in a mossy clearing. It made no sense. There were no roads or ruins nearby. Just the antique crib, corroded by decades of rain, sitting dead center in a barren circle. Silas approached, his leather boots sinking into peat. Inside lay a porcelain doll. Its Victorian dress was rotted to gray tatters, and its cracked face stared blankly up at the canopy. He chuckled nervously and turned to leave. Suddenly, his vest GPS beeped aggressively. Route recalculated. Turn around. The voice was wrong. It wasn't an electronic monotone. It was a panicked woman's voice, tight with terror. Silas stared at the screen. The digital map spun wildly. "What the hell?" he muttered. "Turn around," the device pleaded through heavy static. "He's awake. Oh God, he's awake." A soft, wet squelch sounded behind him. Silas froze. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, he looked over his shoulder. The doll remained in the crib, but its head had turned 90 degrees to face him. The deep cracks on its cheeks oozed a thick, dark fluid smelling of copper and curdled milk. He stumbled backward, dropping his machete. The silence broke instantly, replaced by the terrifying sound of dozens of tiny, frantic hands clapping just beyond the tree line. It was the high-tempo rhythm of children playing a nursery game. Shadows between the pines began to stretch, detaching from the bark, crawling toward him on elongated, disjointed limbs. Silas turned and sprinted. Branches tore at his face like desperate fingers, drawing blood. Behind him, the electronic voice of his dropped GPS echoed through the trees, screaming in agony before cutting into a baby's piercing, metallic wail. He didn't look back until he burst onto the gravel main road. He quit his job the next morning. But the escape was an illusion. Every single night since, when his house grows quiet, Silas lies awake, listening to the rhythmic, unmistakable sound of tiny, wet hands clapping softly against his second-story bedroom window. Elena was a night shift audio engineer tasked with cleaning up old archival tapes for the university's history department. It was monotonous, lonely work, digitizing decades-old lectures and oral histories from long-dead citizens. At 3 a.m., inside an isolated, soundproof basement studio beneath the campus library, the world felt incredibly distant. The heavy foam padding on the walls swallowed every exterior noise, leaving her entirely alone with her headphones and glowing monitors. She opened a digital file labeled Reel 44, 1974 Soundscape Experiment. Minimal log notes stated the tape was recorded by a rogue psychology professor capturing the absolute audio profile of total isolation. When she pressed play, her headphones filled with a low, rhythmic thrum of white noise. It was soothing at first. But as she adjusted the frequencies to filter out the high-end hiss, she noticed a secondary pattern hidden beneath. It sounded like breathing. It was heavy, wet, and rhythmic, coming from a throat clogged with fluid. Elena dragged the slider, isolated the track, and boosted the gain. The breathing grew sharper, filling her ears. Then, a voice broke through the static. It was faint, barely a rasp, but distinctly human. "Is anyone there?" Elena frowned. The notes explicitly stated the tape was recorded in an empty, sealed concrete vault, completely devoid of human presence for 48 hours. She leaned closer, her fingers dancing across the digital soundboard to amplify the vocal track. "I can see you through the glass," the voice whispered. A violent chill cascaded down Elena's spine. The audio from 1974 was describing her current surroundings with terrifying accuracy. She slowly looked up to the large, double-paned observation glass directly in front of her console. The dark studio on the other side was pitch black, reflecting only her pale face and the blue light of her equipment. "Don't turn around," the tape hissed, the static suddenly spiking it. Oh, a harsh, aggressive squeal. The tape isn't a recording anymore. It's a door. And it opens both ways. Elena's heart hammered. She reached for the main power switch, but her mouse cursor refused to obey. It dragged itself across the screens, opening software, pulling master audio levels to an absolute, dangerous maximum. The headphones tore at her ears with a deafening screech of feedback, but through the physical pain, she heard the voice shift. It was no longer coming through her headphones. The rasping, wet breath was vibrating directly against the bare skin on the back of her neck. She felt cold, stagnant air washing over her shoulders, smelling of rot and wet earth. Elena sat frozen, unable to move a muscle, staring at her own terrified reflection in the glass. She watched in horror as a pair of gray, decayed hands slowly reached out from the darkness behind her chair, wrapping firmly around her throat. The luxury downtown apartment was an absolute steal, mostly because the previous tenant had vanished without a trace mid-lease. Julian didn't care about local superstitions or missing persons reports. He cared about the high-end amenities, particularly the floor-to-ceiling smart mirror installed in the master bathroom. It displayed the daily weather, the current time, and global news headlines directly on the glass while he brushed his teeth. For the first week, it was absolute perfection. But on Tuesday night, while preparing for bed, Julian noticed a strange glitch. He was washing his face, his eyes tightly closed against the foaming soap. When he wiped his eyes with a towel and looked up, the mirror image of himself was slightly delayed. It was subtle. His reflection didn't look up until a fraction of a second after he did. Julian blinked. The reflection mirrored the blink, but the timing was off just enough to trigger a deep, instinctual sense of wrongness. "Just tired," he muttered, turning off the running faucet and heading to bed. The next night, however, the temporal delay was significantly worse. Julian raised his left hand to fix his messy hair. In the glass, his reflection raised its hand, but the fingers were subtly elongated, the knuckles bent at slightly unnatural, spider-like angles. More unsettlingly, the reflection wasn't looking at his face anymore. It was staring intently, hungrily, at his exposed throat. Julian backed away from the marble sink, his breath catching. The reflection didn't move with him. Terrified, Julian grabbed a heavy bath towel and threw it over the mirror, taping it down securely with duct tape. He decided he would call the landlord first thing in the morning and demand the smart mirror be entirely removed from the wall. He went to his bedroom, locking the heavy door and shoving a chair under the handle. At exactly 4 a.m., a bright, pale light woke him. Julian opened his eyes, squinting against the unexpected glare. The smart mirror wasn't in the bathroom anymore. It was standing upright on his bedroom carpet, propped against the wall directly at the foot of his bed, glowing with a harsh, neon blue light. The towel and duct tape lay crumpled on the floor. Julian tried to scream, but his limbs felt incredibly heavy, paralyzed by sheer terror. Inside the glowing glass, his reflection slowly climbed out of a mirrored bed, stepping forward until its gray, elongated hands pressed hard against the surface from the inside. With a sickening, wet pop, the reflection's long fingers breached the physical surface of the mirror, sliding into the real world like liquid silver, pulling the rest of its grinning, skeletal body out into the dark bedroom.